Authorities enjoy proclaiming they're advancing your economic prosperity. They discuss security, expansion, possibilities. Yet examining historical patterns closely reveals something considerably grimmer. Authorities have perpetually employed concealed economic maneuvers to maintain common citizens impoverished, while accumulating resources and influence for themselves. And the startling aspect is that these maneuvers are not novel. They've been reused for generations, presented in altered forms, marketed under fresh terminology, yet invariably with identical objectives: to shift resources upward and maintain the majority reliant. Let's begin with the most ancient and straightforward maneuver of all: currency devaluation. When authorities expend beyond what they can collect through levies, they face two alternatives. They can acknowledge reality and levy their citizens transparently, which is politically hazardous. Or they can discreetly dilute the currency, diminishing the worth of every coin and every note in distribution. Ancient Rome perfected this approach. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, emperors confronting military costs began diminishing the silver proportion of the denarius. A coin that previously held nearly pure silver ultimately became predominantly copper, with merely a shallow coating of silver atop. The empire simulated nothing it altered, yet everyone possessing those coins bore the consequences. Price increases exploded, accumulations disappeared, and compensation couldn't maintain pace. It was a concealed levy on the population. A maneuver still employed presently, merely with central banking instead of imperial facilities. The medieval period introduced another iteration of this strategy: compulsory lending. Rulers in England, France, and Spain consistently pressured prosperous traders and associations to advance funds to the throne. Naturally, these weren't willing. Declining meant penalties, seizure, or worse. Occasionally, the throne committed repayment with returns, yet repayment frequently arrived delayed, in weakened currency, or never whatsoever. The authority sustained its conflicts and estates, while traders had minimal option but to relinquish their resources. The maneuver here was compulsion masked as nationalism or obligation, and it functioned for generations. By the 17th century, the economic framework itself became the maneuver. When Britain established the Bank of England in 1694, it wasn't from benevolence. It was because the authority required funds to conduct conflicts with France. Prosperous financiers purchased governmental securities, and reciprocally, the throne guaranteed return payments funded by levies. This appears like an equitable arrangement, yet consider who remitted those levies. Common citizens through charges on commodities like salt, beer, and fabric. The prosperous advanced funds to the authority and secured guaranteed returns. The impoverished remitted elevated levies to finance those return payments. It was a resource redistribution framework presented as national economics, and it established a sequence still functioning presently. The most secure investments globally are advancing funds to authorities, and those returns are ultimately guaranteed by the effort and consumption of the masses. Advance to the contemporary era, and the maneuvers are ubiquitous. Consider deficit expenditure. Authorities accumulate enormous obligations, distributing securities purchased by financiers, banking institutions, and foreign entities. Officials inform the public it's for construction, employment, or welfare initiatives, yet considerable portions channel into military suppliers, business subsidies, and rescues. When repayment moment arrives, authorities don't reduce expenditure at elevated levels. They increase levies, devalue the currency, or reduce welfare provisions. The maneuver is that the obligation appears like it's for citizens, yet the weight lands on their backs while the returns go to the security holders, and then there are institutional rescues. Throughout the 2008 economic catastrophe, banking institutions made reckless gambles, combined problematic mortgages into instruments, and nearly destroyed the planetary economy. Who remitted for it? Common taxpayers through enormous governmental rescues. Who gained afterward? The identical banking institutions, which surfaced larger and more consolidated than previously. The maneuver was straightforward. Privatize the returns, distribute the damages, and the public was informed this was essential to preserve the framework. Even the method authorities manage retirement funds and pension systems is a deceptive manipulation. For generations, citizens in nations like the United States, Britain, and throughout Europe have contributed into government-administered frameworks, believing that the funds would be available when they retired. Yet, authorities frequently don't genuinely preserve that funding. They expend it instantly and leave commitments in its position. The commitment is that subsequent taxpayers will address the expense when the accounting arrives. It is fundamentally a generational pyramid arrangement presented in official terminology. It functions until population statistics transform, populations mature, and abruptly the framework is unviable. Then the authority restructures it, typically by diminishing provisions, elevating the retirement threshold, or devaluing away the worth of distributions. Observe the sequence. At every phase, the maneuver depends on understanding. The public is informed devaluation is expansion, compulsory lending is obligation, national obligation is investment, rescues are security, and pension reductions are restructuring. The terminology conceals the actuality. A redistribution of resources from the numerous to the limited, from the foundation to the summit. And historical evidence demonstrates this maneuver has functioned for generations, because most citizens don't examine economic historical patterns, don't comprehend financial frameworks, and don't perceive the snare until it's belated. In contemporary decades, the maneuvers have only become more elaborate. Consider monetary expansion, a phrase most citizens never even encountered before the 2008 economic emergency. Central banking institutions rapidly generated trillions of dollars from nothing, purchasing governmental securities and mortgage-supported instruments to stabilize markets. Officials and bankers comforted the public this was essential to avert breakdown. And it functioned for the economic framework. Possession valuations skyrocketed. Equities, property, and securities surged in worth. Yet who possesses most of those possessions? The prosperous. For the typical household without substantial investments, the advantages were minimal, while the disadvantage arrived in the manifestation of distorted markets and escalating living expenses. The maneuver here was that currency generation rescued the framework for those at the summit while stimulating devaluation and disparity for everyone else. Another contemporary deceptive manipulation is concealed levying. Instead of elevating income levies directly, authorities discreetly levy through mechanisms like consumption charges, energy charges, and, predominantly, devaluation. When costs escalate faster than compensation, the difference is effectively a concealed levy on accumulations in buying capacity. Authorities appreciate devaluation because it diminishes the genuine worth of their obligations. Yet for citizens, it undermines economic prosperity. You may perceive wealthier because your compensation is elevated in numerical terms, yet if your expenses surpass your earnings, you are genuinely forfeiting resources. This is not a malfunction of the framework. It is the framework. Devaluation is not simply an accident of economics. It is among the most persistent maneuvers authorities deploy to transfer the weight of their expenditure onto you without ever acknowledging it. Then there's administrative manipulation. On the exterior, regulations are intended to safeguard the public. Economic rules, protection standards, consumer safeguards. Yet repeatedly, historical evidence demonstrates us that influential industries shape the administrators intended to supervise them. Transportation in the 19th century, petroleum businesses in the 20th, and technology and economics presently all have influenced rules in their advantage. This is the identical dynamic the Birmingham gang comprehended in reduced scale on the avenues of that city. Superior to possess the arbitrator than to challenge the competition. Authorities employ regulation as an instrument to appear protective, yet behind the facade, the largest businesses carve exemptions that maintain competition suppressed and returns flowing. The public perceives protection. The privileged perceive gain. Conflict financing is another ancient maneuver in fresh presentation. Throughout World War I and World War II, authorities distributed enormous quantities of securities informing citizens it was their nationalistic obligation to purchase them. Citizens believed they were supporting their nation, which they were. Yet these securities also became profitable, secure investments for the prosperous, guaranteed by subsequent levies. In the 21st century, the sequence remains. Trillions expended on conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were financed through obligation, advantaging military suppliers, banking institutions, and security holders, while common taxpayers carried the accounting. The maneuver is that conflicts are invariably characterized as temporary emergencies, yet the economic weights persist for generations, extended after the military personnel have returned home. Authorities also utilize intricacy itself as an economic maneuver. Levy regulations thousands of pages extensive, economic instruments so complicated even specialists struggle to clarify them, financial plans filled with concealed entries and terminology. All of this generates an environment where common citizens cannot possibly monitor how funding is flowing. Intricacy becomes disguise. When you cannot perceive the redistribution of resources, you cannot oppose it. In ancient Rome, diluted coins were a physical indication of the maneuver. Presently, its accounting records buried under abbreviations and unclear initiatives. The maneuver is identical. Render it excessively intricate for the public to pursue, and the redistribution can advance undetected. Why does this signify now? Because the maneuvers are functioning and intensifying. Devaluation consumes away at your accumulations. Obligation burdens expand larger annually. Rescues remain the automatic response whenever markets fluctuate. Central banking institutions persist in manipulating currency availability. While authorities transfer expenses onto the public in manifestations so indirect, most citizens never establish the connections. The outcome is a framework constructed to maintain you laboring intensely for diminished genuine resources, while the economic privileged become more powerful. The principle from historical evidence is not merely that these maneuvers exist, yet that they invariably resurface. When Rome diluted its coins, citizens endured. When rulers compelled lending, traders forfeited fortunes. When contemporary states devalue and borrow, households bear the weight. Different epochs, identical mechanism. And here's the severe reality. Most citizens will never escape these maneuvers because they don't even acknowledge they're being manipulated. They accept devaluation as ordinary, levies as unavoidable, and rescues as demonstrations of compassion. They accept governmental communication instead of examining economic historical patterns. And that unawareness is the most influential maneuver of all. When citizens forget the past, they cannot identify its recurrence. That is why authorities and privileged prefer a public uneducated in economics. Economic education is opposition. Economic historical knowledge is an instrument. If you comprehend the maneuvers, you're more difficult to manipulate. So what should you extract? First, invariably examine beyond the announcement. When authorities proclaim stimulus, inquire who gains first. When devaluation escalates, remember it is not merely unfortunate circumstances, it is deliberate. When regulations materialize, inquire who composed them and who advantages. Second, construct genuine resources outside the snares. Possessions that can maintain worth even when currency does not. Third, never presume the framework operates for you merely because it claims it does. Frameworks exist to safeguard themselves, not you. Historical events don't duplicate, yet if you don't comprehend them, they will devastate you equally. The economic maneuvers that maintained Roman citizens impoverished are the identical ones depleting your banking account presently, only presented in contemporary terminology. The only distinction is whether you identify them in opportunity. If this provided you a fresh perspective, hit subscribe. Historical knowledge has the solutions, and I'll reveal